Welcome back everyone, Patrick here, moving on to the next example. So we're told if three departments A, B, and C take up the floor space in a factory in this ratio over here respectively. So department A to department B to department C. Whereas how much floor space does each department occupy if the total floor space of the factory is 5,768 meters squared? So what we want to do here is figure out what percentage of the factory space does department A take up, what percentage does department B take up, and then what percentage does department C take up. And then once we have the percentages, we could just multiply it by that and then get those respective spaces. Now, you got to be careful. This is a ratio here. It contains fractions, and these aren't the percentages. So for example, this 3/4 here within this ratio for department A, it doesn't mean that department A takes up 75%. Right? In fact, if you converted these to decimals and you added them up, they'd actually be greater than 1. So that wouldn't even make sense. Right? This is a ratio here. So we got to take this and then find these values. And the way we do that is we actually have to total these up. We get that total, what these are based on, that whole number, and then we would divide each of these by the total to get these percentages or these fractions of that floor space. So you can go about it this way. You could add up the fractions if you want. Another thing you could do is you could take this and convert it to have all integers, this ratio, convert the ratio to have all integers. And the way you would do that is you would get a common denominator between all these. So notice that the common denominator between 4, 6, and 5, the lowest common denominator would be 60. So we'd multiply this by 15, multiply the top by 15. So this would be 45 over 60. Multiply this by 10, this by 10. So we'd end up with 10 over 60. Then multiply this by 12, multiply this by 12, so we'd end up with 48 over 60. And then we can just take the numerator. So we'd have 45 to 10 to 48. So this ratio right there, 45 to 10 to 48, is the exact same as the ratio that we were given. And then doing that process of where we add up and then divide each of these by that value, by that total value, it's a lot easier with integers. Notice that when we add all of these up, what's the total going to be? It's going to be 103. And so then all we have to do, department A would take up 45 over 103. And if we were to take this and divide it, it would give us a decimal, then multiply it by 100 to get a percentage. However, I actually recommend leaving this in fractions when you're doing questions like this, because if you start getting decimals, you may start rounding a little bit too much. Versus if we leave it as a fraction, it's going to be more accurate once we multiply by that 5,768. So 45 of 103, that's the fraction of the floor space that department A takes up. 10 over 103 is for department B, and then 48 over 103 is for department C. And then notice that when you add all of these up, if you were to add up all these fractions, you'd end up with 103 over 103, which would be 1 or 100%, right? So that makes sense. These percentages or these fractions that you get over here should always add up to 1 or 100%. Now, again, you could have also got these fractions by adding up these fractions here in the ratio first to get that whole number. And so what you would end up with is you'd end up with 103 over 60. That would be the fraction, the whole fraction, and then Same process, how we took the 45 divided by the 103, you would take the 3 over 4. I'm going to just erase this, we don't need it. You would take the 3 over 4 and divide it by that 103 over 60. And notice what you get. You'd get 3 over 4 times 60 over 103, right? We flip that fraction. Notice that 4 goes into 60 15 times, and you'd end up with 45 over 103, which is the exact same thing we ended up with here. Okay, so whichever way you do it, just make sure that you're getting these same fractions here. And once we have these fractions, well, now to get the floor space for each of these departments, we just have to take the fractions and multiply it by that 5,768. And that's going to give us the meters squared for each respective department. And when you do those calculations, these are the numbers you would get, right? So Department A takes up 2,520 meters squared, Department B 560 meters squared, then Department C 2,688 meters squared. Then you could check your answers too. If you add these up, notice that they're going to add up to that total floor space. Right? So when you get a question like this, take the ratio, convert it to the percentages that each one is taking up of the whole, whatever kind of question you're dealing with. I would recommend leaving it as a fraction versus writing it as a decimal or a percentage. And then take those fractions, multiply it by that whole value you're given, and then you're going to get the respective parts.